Hello and welcome to William's Readings. I'm William Stout, the chaplain for Monarchists of America, and today we are going to be talking about polygamy, polyamory, and open relationships. Now, given the nature of the topic, there is a content warning. Obviously, we're going to be talking about things involving sexual themes and intimate themes, and this is going to therefore be for mature audiences only. Or if you are a minor, feel free to have a parent with you while you're listening to this. But nevertheless, viewer discretion is advised. Now, the reason we are discussing this topic is because I've seen a few interesting things get brought up about polyamory and Christendom as of late. Primarily, someone misunderstanding the story of Onan in the book of Genesis, which we won't touch on just because of how absurd it was. But also, just recently, there's been talk in the Episcopal Church about the church accepting polyamory as acceptable by Christian teachings, which I don't need to point out how absurd that is, but I am, and we're going to go into a full in-depth understanding of how not only that the Bible condemns polyamory and open relationships, but how the Bible and the biblical narrative, starting in the book of Genesis and continuing throughout the Old Testament, enforces specifically monogamy. And you're probably thinking to yourself, wait a minute, don't multiple of the biblical patriarchs have multiple wives? And yes, that is true. But if we go into the biblical narrative and if we talk about their lives and how the Bible describes their lives, we can see an implication that the Bible is not endorsing having multiple wives, but it is in fact condemning it. To start with Abraham, where it all begins. Of course, Abraham and Sarah, his wife Sarah, were far too old to have children, but God still promised that if Abraham obeyed him and he arrived in the promised land, that he would have a son. Sarah, who wasn't as strong of faith as Abraham, eventually convinced Abraham to lay with her handmaiden, Hagar. And this starts a tradition of polygamy that we see common with the biblical patriarchs. But as a result of Abraham laying with Hagar and Hagar giving birth to Ishmael, a contention begins in the household of Abraham, and one that will not be easily solved. This contention begins immediately with the jealousy of Sarah that Hagar managed to bear Abraham a son when she could not. This angered Sarah, even though it was Sarah's idea, into which case I still stand on the soapbox that Hagar was a victim of circumstance and got done dirty, but that's besides the point. But after Ishmael was born, and then after God fulfills his promise and Isaac is born, there is then a contention over which one of Abraham's sons will inherit the birthright. And while it's not mentioned in incredible detail, it is briefly mentioned that Ishmael treated his younger brother poorly because of jealousy, and this ultimately resulted in Ishmael being thrown out of the early Israelite community along with his mother Hagar. Although Abraham, for the love of his firstborn son, prayed to God that he would not perish and that he would live well, and God, loving Abraham as much as Abraham loved his sons, agreed, and Ishmael, as biblical tradition goes, is the father of the Arabs today. Now, what we see here is something that will be repeated again in the book of Genesis with Jacob. And that is that as a result of polygamy, the wives rival each other, and in turn, their children see each other as rivals rather than brethren. And as we go into the story of Jacob and his 4 wives, or 2 wives and 2 maidservants, depending on whether or not you consider the handmaids of Rachel and, I forget the name of Jacob's other wife. Forgive me for that. But regardless, it's not important. But the important part is that Jacob's favoritism. Oh, Leah, that's the name. Jacob's favoritism toward Rachel at the expense of Leah and his other 2 wives causes contention in his household. Primarily when Rachel finally gives birth to a son, that being Joseph. This son is treated with more respect and renown by Jacob, but also is disregarded and becomes a object of jealousy and hate by his other brothers. And it's not just between his other brothers and Joseph. There is rivalry between the other brothers and the other children of the other wives as well. I believe Ephraim and Judah being a primary example, or might have been Ephraim and Levi. It's been a moment since I've read the book of Genesis in this current regard. But the point is that clearly we are seeing that polygamy is causing issues in the family. And it all goes back to polygamy because in relationships in the Bible where we have one husband and one spouse, we don't explicitly see these same things occurring. Now, as we continue, we move into the book of Kings, and then we start to see that with the kings, the practice of polygamy is directly related to the downfalls of each of the kings. David coveted his many wives, and this led to him doing some less than savory things, such as uprooting Saul's daughter from a completely stable and happy relationship because the daughter was promised to him first by Saul when Saul was still alive. And of course, there was the incident of Beersheba in which David steals another man's wife. And I could go on an entire tangent about everything that's wrong with the story of Beersheba and how actually horrific and terrible David's crime was in that instance, but I will not because that deserves its own episode, and I will not digress from this topic to cover that. And of course, it explicitly stated in the Book of Kings that Solomon's wives is ultimately what resulted in the downfall of King Solomon, because Solomon ended up disobeying God and engaging in pagan practices to appease his many foreign wives, rather than just have one wife and be content with a Hebrew woman. Now, if you still don't believe me on the whole nature of the biblical narrative against polygamy, this biblical narrative is actually backed by science and sociology. Sociologists have done the research, they've gone through the statistics. And societies that practice polygamy all suffer from the same problems we see explicitly in the biblical narrative. There's a higher rate of antisocial behavior, a higher rate of domestic violence, of domestic issues and struggles in the household. There's more likely to be disputes and inheritance and legal battles between siblings. It's generally bad for women, as when men have multiple wives, it devalues the role of a woman as a partner, and they become more of a object, a status symbol instead. And it's also, well, it also tends to be on a slight tangent, it also tends to be bad for men too, particularly poor men, because polygamy more often than not benefits the richest men in society at the expense of poor men, creating a gender imbalance in society. So if you don't necessarily want to believe the biblical narrative, if you're not a believer, and I pray to God that you convert and accept Christ into your life. But if you don't believe the biblical narrative, science backs the biblical narrative that polygamy is ultimately poison in every society that practices it. And that the ultimate command of God is that there should be one man, one woman, husband and wife, that the wife should trust in her husband and be obedient to him, and that the husband should love the wife as Christ loved the church. And that means that you should love your wife, you should love your spouse to the point that you would be willing to lay your life down for them. Thank you for joining me on William's Readings. I hope you appreciate my work. If you have another topic you would like me to cover, please leave it in the comments. If you have any questions, also leave them in the comments. I will be happy to answer them all, either in the comments or in a future episode. Thank you, and may God bless.